Not sure if we're live right now. If we can just get some messages or highs in the chat. Live right now. Oh, geez. Live right now. If we can just get some messages or highs in the chat. Live right now. Oh, geez. If we can just get some. Okay, yeah. So I think we're live now, and yeah, I'll just get started. So we're super excited to launch CUSEC with our first keynote speaker. So everyone, Jack Poulson is the very first keynote speaker of CUSEC 2021. He is the executive director for Tech Inquiry, which is a tech accountability nonprofit. Prior to Tech Inquiry, Jack was a research scientist at Google, where he campaigned for human rights as well. And before that, he was an assistant professor of mathematics at Stanford. He's here to share with us today topics from recent ethical crises in tech, and more with his talk, Organizing to Prevent Abuses in Tech. Yeah, and so I'm really excited for the talk, and I hope the rest of you guys are as well. I'll be leaving it to Jack now, and I'll come back in for Q&A. Yeah, okay. Be leaving it to Jack now, and I'll come back in for Q&A.
Thanks. Yeah. Sorry about a little bit of the timing. I had a pretty serious kind of echo delay on my side. So it's great. Sorry about. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, sorry, I figured it out. I had another tab open that had the 30-second delay. So thank you for the introduction. And what I'm hoping to do is talk about essentially what I wish I'd been told when I was entering into the industry. There's a lot to discuss. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a U.S. citizen. I worked for a while in Silicon Valley. I've lived here in Canada for a few years now, and obviously a lot of people who work in software up here end up going down to Silicon Valley. There's numerous issues to talk about with respect to kind of systemic wage discrimination against Canadians by a lot of these companies, but that's a whole nother topic. So what I wanted to focus on was really like, what is it that you need to do if you want to be effective at it changing what it is that your companies are doing for the better. And I've personally been a whistleblower at a major company, in particular Google. And for a while, I really focused on giving talks on how it is that you might do that effectively, when to do it, how to kind of demand for yourself, how to kind of guarantee that your own projects meet ethical standards and, for example, protect human rights. And after spending a few years really actively working on these issues, it's become clear what does make a difference and what doesn't. And you know, definitely whistleblowing is important, but what's perhaps even more important and under stressed is tech workers within companies constantly standing up to management and demanding improvement across a diversity of topics, from, for example, diversity and inclusion, research integrity, sexual harassment, perhaps border surveillance, drone warfare, et cetera. So I'll dig into a little bit of those later on, but there's another topic I kind of wanted to dig into a bit, which was, how did we get here so that unions were really just so much of an anomaly in the tech industry? And why is it that there's so much suppression of labor organizing in tech? So I'll sort of transition over to my slides now, and want to emphasize that it's an honor to get to speak to everybody. Okay, so just this week, there was pretty historic news that more than 250 Alphabet engineers had announced that they were forming a union called the Alphabet Workers Union, which was with the Communication Workers of America's campaign to organize digital employees. Now, I think it's sort of easy to talk about some of these formations without recognizing the really deep history of not just organizing, but suppression of that organizing across the industry. So just a few months earlier, it had been announced that or rather it had been discovered by journalists that Amazon had a job posting that was public where they were seeking to hire an intelligence analyst specifically to track labor organizing threats. And I think what was most disturbing about seeing that was that the company was specifically had it in the job posting that the goal of the intelligence analyst was to find a way to show that the labor organizing was criminal. So not only is Amazon, or rather was this job posting claiming that they were surveilling labor organizing, but they're actually trying to legally counter it. A bit closer to home, in April of last year, workers at Foodora had unionized through the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and the response of the company was to shut down all Canadian operations despite them having been profitable. Even earlier in 2020, two tech workers at Amazon, Emily Cunningham and Marin Costa, had both been fired after they'd spoken up loudly about climate action and the need for further climate action within the company. And even before that, Amazon had fired a worker and leaked PR notes had called him, quote, not smart or articulate, and management had actually argued that they hoped that he became the face of the labor movement for these reasons. It's worth noting that this employee, which they called not smart or articulate, was actually a Black warehouse worker. Earlier in 2020, there was a pretty historic union formed by Glitch, which is sort of an easy-to-use online coding website, which was also through CWA, but actually the month earlier had been the really first historic union in the tech industry, which was Kickstarter, which I'm sure almost everyone is familiar with. And this was through a union. And there's a really interesting online history that the workers that organized this union put up through NYU that I'll share a link with, or a link to at the end of the talk. At the end of 2019, there was a pretty historic firing of labor organizers at Google. It was right around Thanksgiving. These 4 engineers had all been involved in speaking out on issues like, for example, the company taking contracts with Customs and Border Protection. And it was alleged that this involved pretty serious surveillance of their organizing, and there's even active suits with the National Labor Relations Board on this at this time. Digging back further, a group of contractors at Google in September of 2019 actually unionized with the United Steelworkers, which at the time was one of the most significant unionizations. And just even a bit before that, to kind of continue this trend of this kind of balance between organizing and suppression, in August of 2019, Amazon, there was an article that was released talking about what sort of anti-unionization campaign Amazon was running. And, I'm kind of looking at this and getting a sense that it might appear that there's a bit of a contradiction in the way these companies are handling. But, to be clear, Google has also hired a company called IRI Consultants, which has been very widely documented to be, essentially anti-union consultants. And I'll dig further into that later. April 2019, maybe you're sensing a pattern here, but the organizers of the historic Google walkout, where tens of thousands of Google employees across the world walked out to protest sexual harassment, later claimed that they were retaliated against for their work as organizers. August of 2018, a group of Microsoft bug testers had unionized. They were with a startup union called the Temporary Workers of America that was in collaboration with coworker.org. They were dismissed. And what I think is lost a lot in these discussions is that actually it wasn't sort of the white collar tech workers that were really leading. It was really the bus drivers and kitchen staff in Silicon Valley that were the first to start forming unions. For example, in December of 2017, Amazon shuttle drivers joined the Teamsters. They weren't the first. Actually, a group from LinkedIn and Twitter had done that at the beginning of 2017 and all the way back to 2015, some Facebook bus drivers had won a raise by unionizing with the Teamsters. And actually, there was a lot more history in between those time periods that I left out that I was involved in a bit with, where essentially what had been happening is that kitchen staff at Intel had been voting to form unions. And the moment that they would go up for union votes, Intel would say, okay, well, now we're going to have a different company for our kitchen staff. And so I guess you're all fired. And so it wasn't technically firing the workers for unionization, but it was kind of working around it. And so what Santa Clara County and Silicon Valley did was pass a rule that said, if you switch contracting companies, then you have to fire particular staff for cause. You can't just get rid of everyone because you chose to go with someone else. And I happened to be at the city council vote where that was debated. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me because I saw the type of industry managers that showed up for that vote to argue why it was perfectly fine to fire all of these workers, and that because they were so in demand, it was no big deal for them to lose their job. And that's really stuck with me, that there is definitely a portion of industry that stands up against the rights of these highly underpaid, highly underappreciated workers. And so it kind of taught me that as a privileged tech worker, if I'm not standing up and me and my coworkers aren't standing up, then who is? Okay, so even before that, kind of getting to core wage issues in Silicon Valley, it's important to remember that there was actually an antitrust action against numerous tech companies in Silicon Valley after it was discovered that they had been wage fixing in the, say, 2005 to 2007 timeframe. And this diagram is actually from the lawsuit, which ended up with a $415 million settlement, which shows what sorts of wage fixing agreements were in place. For example, between Google and Apple, between Apple and Pixar, between Google and Intel. And what these negotiations had involved was the executives at the very highest levels directly agreeing with each other that they would not poach, if you will, or directly hire engineers from each other's companies because they knew that would drive up wages. Well, that's starting to sound a bit like anti-competitive behavior, and that's indeed what the courts ruled. And so, what I hope you understand from these sorts of things is that these companies are organizing against your interests as workers. And if you're not organizing as well, then clearly you're going to be in a disadvantage and you might discover that your wages were reduced. So where did all this come from? Which I think is a really important question that isn't asked nearly enough. Well, if you go back, and as someone who spent some time at Stanford, what you'll notice is that the engineering quad at Stanford has two buildings, one named after Hewlett and one named after Packard. And they're really central, like the Double E building, for example, is the Packard building. There's a teaching building that's named after Hewlett. And Hewlett Packard, despite, how you may see them now, perhaps as a, kind of a waning company, they've actually largely determined the culture of Silicon Valley to this day. And so there's a direct quote from David Packard in 1992, quote, "The Democratic Party has been the party of socialism since," he said Roosevelt, but clearly he's referring to FDR, and claimed that it's indentured to union labor. So he was very against unionized labor, and Hewlett and Packard introduced this management style called the HP way. They wrote a book on it, in fact. Steve Jobs even wrote a note on a later version of it, and it became the prototype for Silicon Valley. The essential idea was if you set up an environment that's really cushy, you can interpret it as an egalitarian, informal, then why would employees ever unionize? So think of free lunches, think of stock options, sodas in the kitchen, these sorts of things. That's not, for nothing. The point of that originally was to say, look, we're fair, and because we're fair, you don't need to organize. Everything's great for you already. You work so hard to get here. just be happy that you are where you are, because you'll never get anything better. And so if you wanted to look into a really detailed history of, kind of the origins of Silicon Valley, I highly recommend a book called The Code by Margaret O'Mara, who's a historian at the University of Washington. Okay, so, beyond inspiring this, management style for a generation of tech companies, David Packard was actually the Deputy Secretary of Defense under the Richard Nixon administration. And many of its spinoffs have played really integral roles in sort of the tech defense contracting space. So, for example, they acquired Cray, which, pretty famous for supplying supercomputers for example, intelligence agencies. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Perspective, which does a ton of, military and defense and intelligence contracting right now. And, like I mentioned before, in this slide, you see a picture of the Packard building that sits right at the kind of entrance to the engineering quad at Stanford. Beyond being prominent there, they're also a core member of the Stanford Research Park. So, again, however you may view them as maybe not that influential at the moment, trust me, they influence the culture. Okay, so, beyond this kind of HP way, cushy kind of environment at work, I think it's equally important to recognize what role human resources plays just by quoting them. You can just see in their own words how they view unions as something that it's their job to oppose. So, a motivation for why you might look at the Society for Human Resource Managers. In December of 2020, they announced a partnership with Google. By no means is anything in this announcement damning at all. I mean, it's, talking about connecting people with jobs. But if you look at the sorts of material the organization promotes kind of amongst its members as opposed to in its press releases, you start to see things like this, like how can we prevent a union from organizing in our company? Well, what sorts of strategies do you see? Like you want open door management policies where employees can trust their management, essentially saying like make the work environment friendly enough that workers are not going to see any motivation to unionize. Yet another article, take 7 steps to minimize chances of unionization. Similar things like train management on how to have positive employee relationships. And then, they get a little bit more aggressive towards the end, preparing a first round of union avoidance materials. And then one of these, I think I'll give them a bit of benefit of the doubt, but saying analyzing an organization's weaknesses, sounds a bit to me like surveilling the organizers in the potential union to see how to disrupt it. Okay, so beyond their pretty explicit stance of opposing unions, I think, in the post-COVID world, it can't be stressed enough just how much workplace surveillance is relevant and is going to increase, especially with increased kind of diffusion of artificial intelligence throughout all sorts of products. There was a white paper that I found particularly alarming that was from September of last year. So it was released by kind of a trade union of sorts, or a trade organization for the US intelligence community called INSA. And it was called Human Resources and Insider Threat Mitigation. And if you pull up my slides, which I shared a link to at the beginning, all of these are active links. You can read this for yourself. What it's really talking about is how human resources needs to be used as a core part of surveillance of employees, and that it's really critical that employees trust human resources so that they share all of the information that the company can use to determine who it is that they need to monitor more closely, which really comes across disingenuous to me in terms of the degree to which employees should actually trust human resources. So this is one of the quotes from the white paper from a counterintelligence officer at a Fortune 100 company. Just so you know that Amazon job posting of a counterintelligence officer to monitor labor organizing, that's not completely unique. This is a thing. And so this quote saying about 50% of their leads for, quote, insider threats were brought by data from HR. There's a pretty blunt quote in this into how companies monitor their workforce. Quote, simply put, they depend upon monitoring physical access, cyber access, digital communications, and other tools focused on finding negative and concerning activity. Well, I mean, certainly from a security perspective, a lot of that might make sense, but as you start to dig in a bit further as to what sorts of things that they might monitor, they start talking about how financial stresses are something that they need to monitor, as well as your marital status, which I find a bit incredible. And so what they say is that while one of these is not indicative of an insider threat, risk is increased if concerning behaviors are observed in the context of one or more stressors. And so really what they're talking about is how human resources needs to monitor the debt levels and the marital status of its employees so that they can make sure that the company doesn't lose money. Okay, so part of why I bring this up in this talk is there's a section of this white paper that really very clearly lays out that unions are really the only thing that opposes this kind of surveillance. And so there's a section at the end where it says, there's a quote myth that the insider threat program can't do anything because it's too difficult to work with union. And with the union, and what they then start to talk about is how they're forced to negotiate with unions to make sure that there's limitations on the scope and that they're not being too invasive, which is another way of saying if you don't have a union, no one's standing up for you on these issues. The companies will surveil you to whatever extent they want for their insider threat program, and you can maybe answer the question for yourself as to whether that includes standing up for labor issues or perhaps against company abuses more broadly. I think that the history might be clear on what tends to be in scope. There's a video actually that's up. I linked to it in my slides that actually digs in a bit on what type of information is really being collected in real time. There's a company called ForcePoint that until recently was a subsidiary of Raytheon Technologies, which was a merger between two defense giants, Raytheon and United Technologies Corporation. And in these slides, it's actually laid out what sorts of things are being collected. There's kind of two acronyms in this slide you may not be familiar with, DLP and UAM. UAM stands for User Activity Monitoring, and DLP is data loss prevention. And I think the key part of this slide, well, two key parts. One is the insider risk dashboard on the left that shows somebody monitoring the results of what users are up to. And on the right side is the collectors portion, which shows what sorts of things are being captured. And so I saw this and that it contains, a keyboard, pretty suggestive that they're monitoring keystrokes, but then actually 14 minutes into the talk, they talk about how they want to incorporate data from human resources and performance reviews within this kind of user activities monitoring. And, even at this point, I was fairly disturbed, but then and actually looking up some of these acronyms, I discovered that this is actually much worse than I thought it was, because at least, this video is nominally in the context of, in the white paper was in the context of the intelligence community. Yes, there were quotes from Fortune 100 companies, but at least kind of there was a bit of plausible deniability that this wasn't being targeted at your average business. Right? Well, unfortunately, if you want, pull up your browser, go to a site, terramine.co, click on the try a live demo button, and prepare to be pretty disturbed. I think this is the future that you can expect as a worker, is this kind of lack of respect for your privacy. And so, what these things are really, this business is describing what it's doing is increasing productivity of the business by surveilling to a really intense degree what employees are up to, which is very similar to what I just was talking about with HR. And if you click on the live demo, you see it pulls up a dashboard, and I clipped it here, but it's a list of all the employees, their picture, what they're currently doing, what website are they on, what is their breakdown of how active they've been at work, what's the kind of ID of their computer, and you can really click through and surveil to a pretty intense degree what each employee is up to. So for example, There's a tab they show you where it shows a live desktop from every employee to see what they're literally at that moment doing on their computer. They're explicit that they track all comments and posts that you make on social media, what social networks you use. They track, they'll show literally down to the message that you're posting on social media, which platform. They have a way for you to click a button to watch a live video of what you were doing on your computer screen when a particular message was posted on that platform, whether Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. Monitor emails and what the contents are. Keystroke monitoring, they're pretty blunt about. Not only did they monitor the keystrokes, but again, they have this feature where you click on a button and you see what the full computer screen was when a particular set of keys was being typed. All of this, I think, pretty aggressive. And again, I really want to hammer in that, perhaps, one can justify such a thing in a really serious kind of governmental agency where they're dealing with very sensitive user data, like some intelligence service, perhaps. But unfortunately, this business is pretty blunt that this is even for startups, right? Like, and not only is it for those sorts of serious environments, they also marketed it for productivity optimization. And this isn't unique. There was a pretty big scandal recently about Microsoft 365 having similar kind of activity monitoring of all the different employees. And in fact, in response to that, in similar framing, there's a union in the UK called Prospect that recently wrote a letter to the ICO, really standing up against increases in worker productivity monitoring. And I think it's a sign that labor unions are starting to really take a serious role in protecting workers against such things. But unfortunately, there's a lot of progress to be made in North America before that's going to happen here. Okay, so beyond wages, workplace surveillance, what issues are tech workers organizing to improve or oppose? Most of what is left in this talk is, I think, going to be more familiar to people. It tends to be what's more in the headlines. So very recently, Google famously fired Timnit Gebru, who's a very prominent AI ethics researcher. She was one of the founders of Black in AI. And they fired her for a paper, which, if you read it, was, I think, pretty mild in its critique and pretty fair. But the fundamental issue was that it did not come across as painting Google in a positive light. And so the company argued that it should not be published. Well, in response, numerous Google researchers at the company stood up behind her. And I think if you have been following this issue, you might notice that there's been a pretty constant surge of support. And, that's not a one-off thing. This is the result of sustained organizing in this industry. Okay, so, beyond diversity, inclusion, and research integrity issues, there's been a lot of organizing against kind of consumer-oriented tech companies becoming more involved in immigrant surveillance and border surveillance. And in fact, this headline, my nonprofit was the one responsible for the Freedom of Information request behind it that found it. It was found that Google Cloud was mentioned in a statement of work by a defense contractor as explicitly processing the thermal imagery from Anduril's sentry towers that would be deployed across the U.S.-Mexico border. And this was not unpredictable. Over a year earlier, more than 1,000 Google employees had signed a public letter opposing the company working with Customs and Border Protection because I think they saw where this work might be going. And to be clear, after workers stood up against this contract being made public, the CEO of Google Cloud just denied it and said that despite it being in the statement of work, he's been assured it won't happen. And so there's a bit of a fog where these tech companies want to sell their cloud and their APIs for to essentially everyone, but then to claim no moral culpability for what the products are being used for. Okay, so there's also been a lot of organizing around minimizing effects on climate change. For example, organizers at Amazon have really spoken out, and arguably it was their organizing that led to Jeff Bezos committing $10 billion to address climate change. Again, as I mentioned, several of these people ended up being fired as a result of their activism, but it's had a major impact. Sexual harassment has actually been the thing that's really kicked off the most kind of prominent organizing. So the Google walkout that I think everyone is familiar with happened just days after this really damning expose about Andy Rubin's sexual harassment at Google. And again, like the expose came out on October 25th, and by November 1st, tens of thousands of Google workers had walked out in protest of the sexual misconduct. And so I think it's been a bit of a trope that people have treated that walkout as kind of the beginning and the end of major, or at least the beginning of major employee activism. And hopefully you take away from this talk that that's not the case. Even before the walkout, actually, this was kind of what got me into working on a lot of these issues. It had been revealed by an investigative journalist at The Intercept that Google, despite all of its public commitments, circa 2010, that it had internally decided to roll back its human rights protections, and that it was now okay with, when a government asked it to, censor topics like human rights or criticism of particular government officials, that it was okay with doing that if the market, demanded it. So workers ended up protesting this, actually publicly resigned over this and campaigned for quite some time. And I think it's an important component of tech worker activism is really protecting freedom of speech issues. And, I'll say as an aside that I think this is one of the issues in this list that I think is pretty firmly apolitical or nonpartisan in the U.S., and that support for it was, I think, pretty broad across the political spectrum. Okay, so but even before that, there were major protests against drone warfare. In particular, for those of you not familiar, there's been a broad push from what you might consider like kind of narrow field of view drone surveillance into what's called wide area motion imagery, or WAMI. And the fundamental problem that was laid out in a report from RAND for the Air Force was that it was just so much data that for the Air Force to constantly monitor all of that footage, it would take 1/3 of all of the members of the Air Force for the amount of drone surveillance that they wanted to do. And so what was proposed is that the only solution is artificial intelligence to alleviate that kind of human burden. And so as early as 2013, one can find quotes from, for example, NVIDIA executives talking about how their GPUs are really going to be the key to eliminating that 1/3 of all airmen problem, because their GPUs are so good for running artificial intelligence on computer vision. And so in 2018, when Googlers started to realize that their company's computer vision was being customized to build object detection, and by objects, I mean people, cars, for the purposes of deployment in countries like Afghanistan. They were not happy. They protested in a pretty sustained way for months, ended up getting the contract canceled. And at the moment, Google's posture is that they will supply cloud computing, but they will not build custom targeted artificial intelligence for war. And then this led actually to pretty significant policy changes, or at least posturing on policy changes across the Department of Defense and the intelligence community in the United States. So Google released its so-called AI principles. As a result of this controversy, the Department of Defense then released its own AI principles, though very narrowly targeted to what's new about AI, and then the Office of the Director of National Intelligence of the US, which, for example, oversees activities of the CIA, released its own principles as well. Okay, so Tech Inquiry and its members have been, very proud to play, a supporting role in a few of these campaigns, as I mentioned, Dragonfly and some of the customs and border protection work. What we found is that there's this tough kind of balance where in tech, I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to build things as a way to argue that, that's how you contribute to the change you want to see in the world, is just build more software. I think to first order, one needs to reject that, but not to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say you can't research effectively anymore. And so what we found is that by really getting more efficient at monitoring public data sets, like, for example, federal procurement, legal cases against labor suppression, lobbying data, et cetera, basically the types of data sets that would be interesting to investigative journalists, that you can really kind of help support accountability in this space and inform some of the activity from worker organizing. And, as a scrappy group of tech workers, you don't necessarily have the money to pay for lawyers that would be used for freedom of information request battles. But what you can do is still submit them, fight them however you can, and proactively curate interfaces to databases. And I'll say, like, as someone who built recommendation systems in a major company, that was kind of one of my interests, is like to be able to answer questions like what companies are like Palantir. And yes, you can build pretty good models for that, but in practice, what really matters is just very good, very broad curation of corporate data sets, like a lot of entity normalization, to be honest. Okay, so I'm gonna, for the purpose of kind of opening up time for questions, I'm gonna fly through a bit of the last few slides. Like I mentioned, federal procurement, lobbying data, National Labor Relations Board, Securities and Exchange Commission filings. You could build scrapers for a lot of this stuff pretty easily with beautiful soup. But again, the real work is in kind of manually cleaning up these data sets for each company. And then kind of the motivation has been, when you have this really good kind of feed of intelligence on these companies, you can then use that to target freedom of information requests or know where to dig deeper. Okay, so you can check out this tool that we use. We make it public. It's available here at techinquiry.org/explore. It's got a little autocomplete for companies, and you can pull up their profiles. Don't hammer it too hard. We're pretty scrappy and don't have a lot of budget for the server, but it's there nonetheless. We have a couple of reports that you might find interesting. Each was quite a lot of many months of work. Really digging into the interface between U.S. tech companies and the Department of Defense to kind of dispel some myths that there was this giant divide. And then we have a report on tax evasion from these tech companies, and I think that one's of particular interest given recent political changes in the U.S. But I'll kind of leave that there. And we gave a previous talk that went into more detail of some of the kind of technical components of this work. Future work is allowing users to contribute, much more curation of politicians and lobbyists, detailed study of their networks, and then incorporating more, like yet another data source for how companies and individuals donate to political causes. Some closing thoughts, which I think aren't emphasized enough. Yes, labor organizing is critical. Yes, whistleblowing is critical. And these things need not be seen as entirely separate, or with one of them, whistleblowing, for example, being contained within labor organizing. You need not look further than in countries like Germany that have very strong labor protections, but some fairly weak whistleblower histories, for example, VW, to understand that, you always need to have safety mechanisms, even if you have representation of workers. And obviously investigative journalists play a huge role in kind of exposing corporate malfeasance. as do civil society researchers and independent activists. And, you know, I'll say I don't think enough attention is paid in these circles to the vast influence of corporate lobbying. In particular, that one can view that as a counterforce to organized labor. So whether your interest as a software engineer is, you know, just better salaries for yourself, fairer rules around open source side projects, it's often the case that you don't get any intellectual property that isn't immediately owned by the company, even if you did it in your free time. Issues like workplace surveillance that I mentioned, whether you're fighting for more diversity and inclusion, better research integrity, or just protecting human rights in an industry that seems to have given up on that for international market access. I think it's time that we move on from a debate over is a union good or bad, but rather to move on to what kind of union do you want to build? Do you want like a solidarity union, like a kind of a workers union where it's all about workers being taught how to stand up for themselves versus, you know, perhaps you could view that as an alternative to going with one of the major unions. And really, I want to emphasize that none of this is hidden. It's all in the open that companies are really performing very detailed monitoring on employee activities. And so please, if you're doing anything really strategic that would be sensitive for management to know, do not do it on a device that you've ever installed corporate software on. Do it on your personal phone through something like Signal. You know, just trust me on that. So if you want maybe a more uplifting version, maybe this came across as a bit of a downer. The Kickstarter union oral history is incredible, really entertaining, very well polished. Labor Notes, Secrets of a Successful Organizer is also great. And if we can help out Tech Inquiry, please reach out at info@ or directly to me at Jack @ and you know my Signal information is public as well. And thank you. So if we could open up for a few questions, it looks like we have a couple minutes for that.
Oh, jeez. Oh, my God. Okay. Holy, oh my gosh. Are you able to hear me at this time? Sorry. Okay.
I can.
Okay, yeah, I think my camera isn't working for some reason. At this time, because we have the next speakers coming on, unfortunately, we won't have time to just do the Q&A session. But for everyone in the chat, we do have the Discord section for Jack, for all the VIP members of the CUSEC conference. And so if you do have the VIP ticket, then you'll be able to message your questions in the Discord channel. I think I can still speak for everyone, though, that this was like a very informative talk that I think a lot of us weren't aware of with regards to all the topics that you brought up. Yeah, sorry about the video, but I think that would be it just because we have to prepare for the next speaker coming in. But yeah, just all the talks will be recorded for just everyone who would be looking for these sessions. And again, if you do have questions, just make sure to put them into Jack Poulson's Discord text channel. And yeah, just thank you so much, Jack. It was really great having you on this on this first keynote speaker.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.